everybody. Welcome to the Focus Group podcast. I'm Sarah Longwell, publisher of the Bulwark, and today we're going to be talking about inflation. It is the kitchen table issue on everybody's mind, and in fact, one of the number one places it's hurting voters is in the kitchen. This probably sums up how you're feeling about inflation right now.
It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous.
It's crazy.
It's crazy.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Ludicrous.
People are not happy about inflation. So over the last 6 weeks or so, we've done a lot of different groups. We've done Republicans, we've done Democrats, we've done folks in Texas, we've done swing state voters, we've done young voters. And while they talk differently about just about everything, the one thing they all sound the same on is how concerned they are about inflation and rising prices. So, with me today, I have my best friend and secret podcast co-host, Jonathan B. Last. JBL, thanks for being here for this very exciting topic.
Thanks for having me. I'm ready to play.
So I got to tell you, just as a background piece of information, originally there were supposed to be primaries right now. North Carolina primary was supposed to be happening. For legal reasons, they have moved their primary. And so I thought we'd get into some issues because these issues are going to be, based on what I'm hearing from voters, they're going to be top of mind going into this election.
Sure, unless there's a nuclear war.
Unless there's a nuclear war. That's true. So let's hear some of these voters talking about the price of food, which I would say is the number one thing that comes up.
I've lately been buying milk at the dollar store and this kind of thing. And I think that it's just my reaction. It's not really consciously, I just look at the prices in the grocery store and whatnot and say, oh my gosh, that's really expensive. And then I go somewhere else and I find a better price.
My grocery prices are out of control. I eat at home a lot and cook, and my grocery bills are outrageous. They're so much higher than they normally are.
The attitude of America is suffering because we just don't know how to handle this because we've never had this before in our lifetime. So inflation is on top of that, and it hurts because it hurts me. I cook for a living for another family. They pay me and the prices are going up. So how much profit am I going to get now?
So JVL, prices are rising at the fastest rate in probably 40 years. And Joe Biden is stuck in the low 40s, high 30s, depending on what poll you're seeing. Although I did just see one from NPR that has him jumping after the State of the Union up to 47%. But my question for you, and with, as you mentioned, the war going on, which is likely to potentially increase prices as well, how do you see this playing in the upcoming election?
I suspect inflation, as you said, is probably going to be part of the main case against Biden and Democrats for reasons which don't make a ton of sense. When people say, my grocery bills are out of control, which is one of the things we heard, I understand things have risen. The consumer price index rose 7.5%. This is not Weimar Germany. People are not running around with wheelbarrows full of dollars to buy a loaf of bread. And to a weird extent, the Democrats underplayed the inflation problem early. And they had a big, no, this is just transitory inflation. It's not systemic inflation. And that was not helpful. But there is this overcorrecting in the media about the true extent of it. And the problem is that wages have not kept pace with inflation. Now, wages are up. I think 1.5% last year over year. So the problem here is getting wage growth to catch up with the inflationary pressures. But the gas is separate, right? There are some inflationary pressures on gas prices, but there are many other pressures on gas prices. For instance, a war with a major oil producing country. So I would say one of the things that struck me in listening to these groups was that the Republican members of your groups seemed to have a much less sophisticated view of the overall picture than the Democrats did.
That's an interesting point. Actually, I'm going to get into that, the sort of one key difference between Republicans and Democrats on this. But just sticking with food prices for a second, I want to talk about Virginia, because this is what jumped out to me when I was hearing about food prices. Is that I did a bunch of focus groups post-game in Virginia after Youngkin won and asked people, what was the best ad? Like, what was the ad that really changed their mind? And so many of them mentioned his grocery ad, because he had this, we're going to lower grocery prices. And that really made a difference to voters. Like, that's what they were hearing. And so I think that you're right to say that the Biden administration was slow to realize the impact that it was having. I mean, I heard it early on in focus groups, and including, like, the thing that really struck me is just the Democrats sounded like the Republicans. They were under pressure. They felt it. I think, you mentioned the geopolitical issues going on at the moment, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Did you know that Russia is one of the main exporters of low-cost fertilizer around the world? And when I saw that, I thought, there's a bunch of Wall Street Journal articles about this right now. All the business folks are talking about it. Bloomberg had a story. They were quoting, an Iowa farmer who was saying, I think this quote was like, if you think they'll squawk about gas prices, wait until their grocery bill is $1,000 a month. And so, like, this is a real pain point for people. And my question for you is, how much of it would you say, like, does Joe Biden have any control over this?
Minimal control, I think. Because what this is all really about is a gestalt sense of how everything is going. Let me just tick off some numbers for you, okay? About the actual economic reality in America right now. The U.S. financial markets are overperforming the world by the biggest margin in the 21st century right now. Under Joe Biden, his first 12 months were far and away the best first 12 months of any president in 50 years. Unemployment currently 4%. Real inflation-adjusted GDP was up 5% in each of the first 3 quarters of 2021, more than double the average of GDP growth since 1976. Here are 10 market indicators for Biden's first year against the first years of presidents for the last 50 years. On gross domestic product growth, Biden is number 1. Profit growth, Biden number 1. S&P 500 performance, Biden number 2. Consumer credit, Biden number 1. I just keep ticking through these. The broader economy is doing very, very well. The problem is the overall gestalt of, things aren't great. Boy, there was this amazing moment a couple months ago where somebody, I think it was NBC, did a poll asking people what they thought about the stock market. The stock market was at an all-time high. Under Biden, the Biden's first year stock market was insanely high. And 46% of the country said that the performance of the stock market was very disappointing. And 56% of the country said that they were disappointed with Biden's handling of the stock market. What the president does to handle the stock market, who can say? But even so, just in their general, do you approve of the stock market? And their answer was no, we don't. And so I don't know what there is for Biden to do to touch that stuff, except to fix the overall sensation in people's minds of how things are going. Now, you can do that through COVID, right? That is a necessary precondition for any sort of political recovery. But now you have this major European theater war, which could escalate into something even worse than it is now. And for now, the best case scenario is probably just that it is a gigantic humanitarian disaster in the heart of Eastern Europe. Those things are going to be hard to fix, and they are going to contribute to the overall sense of what are things like under Joe Biden. And the inflation stuff just becomes like the air that people breathe. They talk about it as if it's this thing. And even when the economic reality is quite different.
Okay, so this is a point you and I, if anybody listens to the Secret Podcast, you and I are in constant, somewhat disagreement about, because I think that perception is reality, especially when it comes to voting behavior. But you brought up gas before. Gas comes up all the time. So let's hear what voters were saying about gas prices.
I think I'm finding that I'm trying not to travel as much. I've got 5 drivers in our house. So, I'm just like, if you could keep it to one trip, doing all your stuff, I think I might be looking at that a little bit more.
I noticed myself limiting going here, then going there. I try to do it all at once if I'm going to be running errands.
I remember during Trump, I even took a picture at the gas station. I paid like $2.30 for premium gas. And now you can't even buy regular unless it's like $3 or more.
So that last voter, she's a Trump voter, clearly more impressed with Donald Trump's handling of gas prices. So gas is roughly like $3 a gallon right now. And as you say, I mean, one of my concerns here is that I mentioned fertilizer, but what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, one of the most localized outcomes of that for Americans is the likelihood that gas prices will continue to increase. And you've seen this, right? Where if you go to a gas pump in Pennsylvania, oftentimes there will be somebody will have put a sticker on the pump with a little image of Biden that says like he did this, and then it like points to the number. And to me, this is like a lose-lose situation for Joe Biden because he already knows how price sensitive people are about gas. And yet, one of the main levers that we have in pushing Russia on Ukraine is to stop buying their gasoline, stop importing it, which is going to increase prices further. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, the gasoline price sensitivity is one of these bits of small d democratic incoherence where people are constantly, they think back to 10 years ago when gas is so cheap, but 10 years ago they were complaining about how expensive gas was because they were comparing it to 10 years before that. This is how irrational people operate in the world, and most people are irrational. And whether or not Russian gas is accepted into the international trading system, the fact of the Russian central bank being cut off makes Russia selling gas, like the actual act of buying and selling, very, very difficult, whether or not the rest of the world says they are willing to make that trade, period, right? So we're going to see rising prices on top of just, remember risk premiums? Remember we used to talk about this, and people may have forgotten this, but 20 years ago.
It. What is a risk premium?
Every time there was a bombing in the Middle East somewhere, gas prices would go up. Why would they go up? Not because gas had suddenly become more expensive because the USS Cole had been hit by a bunch of terrorists, but because the market was pricing in the possibility that a wider conflict was going to ensue that would eventually cut off gas supplies. So, and this is what the economists call the risk premium inherent in gasoline pricing. And so that is largely what has been happening over the course so far of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And we can expect to see real premiums increasing as supplies dry up. And it's going to be very difficult. This is why wars are bad. This is why we try to avoid wars.
Yeah, but can I ask you, so Nancy Pelosi and a lot of Republicans right now are calling on Joe Biden to stop importing gasoline from Russia, like stop buying gas from Russia. And Jen Psaki was asked about this, and the White House is saying, no, they're not going to stop. And I think that is because Joe Biden he's always been somebody who's very sensitive to this idea of hitting people in their pocketbooks in this. In fact, I've got a clip from 2008 when he was running for vice president. Here, let's listen to that.
I was recently at my local gas station, asked a guy named Joey Danko, I said, Joey, how much it cost to fill your tank? You know what his answer was? He said, I don't know, Joe. I never have enough money to do it. The middle class needs relief, tax relief. They need it now. They need help now. The focus will change with Barack Obama.
So it feels like Biden has just always, like his sort of sympathy for the little guy, for wanting to take pressures off of lower income folks. That is why he's reticent to punish Russia specifically in ways that will raise gas prices for people. What do you think he should do?
Boy, one of the few things that I think he did wrong in the very early weeks of the administration was killing the Keystone Pipeline. I think Keystone XL should have been kept alive. I think that working more closely with Canada in gas exports from there, Canada, I think, is the third largest number of proven reserves in the world. That is a mistake. And it was a mistake at the time. And it was politically a mistake. The Keystone Pipeline was pretty popular, just not among Democrats, which was the problem. It was deeply unpopular among Democratic voters, which is why that was one of his sops to his own party. What Biden is doing here is very, very clearly understanding the link between political viability at home and the ability to project power abroad. He understands that all the tanks and all the missiles and all the airplanes in the world are absolutely useless if the voters in the democracy don't support involvement in a conflict. And he's trying to take care of that in ways that I think are quite responsible, and for which, again, I expect him to get almost no credit from voters.
So the three things I hear about on the economy and on prices going up, it's food, grocery store prices, it's gas, and then the third thing that I hear a lot of, especially for people who are in their late 20s and 30s, is rent and housing prices.
I feel it on the daily, that with anything from going to the corner store to going to the grocery store. And then right now we're living in a smaller place because I'm trying to save to buy land. And even looking at land in other places, it's just crazy how everything's gone. And then with the pandemic and everything else, it's just jumped and skyrocketed on everything, even small plots, quarter acres, stuff like that. It's went nuts. Okay, like you used to be able to get like an acre of land, you might be able to get one for $1,000 if you look in the right place. But nowadays you're looking at an acre for like 10 grand in some places.
My rent went up in 1 year, and I'm living in the same place like year after year is crazy. Like, I've been looking to buy a house sometime like in the next couple years, and it's almost impossible. Like for reference, like one of my friends bought a house before COVID, and it was like a moderately priced, let's say it was like $450,000 house. Now, like the same houses are selling for like $600,000, $700,000.
So home prices are scaring me. Our old house that we bought, it tripled in price. You can't find anything the moment that something goes on the market. It goes over $50,000 to $75,000.
So you would agree with me, right? Because I think if I had to boil down our disagreement, which we have all the time, yours is that you're frustrated with voters' perspectives on this. And my response is like, okay, but like that was a mix there of Democrats and Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
The pain is real, right? The reality of the situation is that they are feeling prices go up at the pump, in the grocery store, where they live, like in the places that are the most essential to their lives. And I just don't see, whether they're not thinking big enough about the broader economy, like, rich people care about the market. These are people trying to figure out, like, do they have to drive less so that they can afford gas? Like, to me, that just seems like the kind of thing that is deadly for the party in power, regardless of whether or not the party in power is actually to blame.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. And the real estate thing, I really flagged all of that part of these groups because the understanding, especially the gentleman talking about the plot of land, right? The acre that you used to be able to buy an acre of land for $1,000, now it's $10,000. This is a guy who I think does not really understand what's been going on, right? So this current surge in real estate prices goes back about a decade. It begins with the actual recovery from the last housing bust, which went from 2004 to 2009. And it has increased a lot over the last 3 years for a couple reasons. One of which has been the persistence of low interest rates, even under the expectation that the interest rates were going to start rising. The increase of remote work, which has liberated potential buyers to start looking in diverse places. The giant increase in the corporate buying of residential properties. So you've had a lot of big groups coming in, buying up residential properties and turning themselves into landlords. And finally, the decreased supply of properties as people are becoming reluctant to sell. So what you look at, you see housing inventories all across the country, way, way down. And that this is why prices have gone up. Now, somebody else in one of your groups here said that he really wants to slow things down. That was his response. This was a Republican. No, I'm sorry. One of the Democrats said they really wants to slow things down. I promise you that when things slow down, it will be because interest rates are rising and that these same consumers will not like it at all. When interest rates rise and the price of getting a mortgage goes way, way up, and all of a sudden the people who are sitting on homes and want to sell, can't sell them, they're going to look at it and say, we'll see how terrible this is. My point is that a lot of this stuff is kind of zero sum. And if you are sitting on a house right now, you're super happy with the housing bubble. If you're a first-time home buyer, it's really frustrating and scary. And everybody who's sensible looks at this stuff and thinks it's not sustainable. But when the correction comes, nobody ever likes the correction either.
And so I'm so glad you brought up this point. I think it's a crucial point. Interest rates are starting to go up, right? They're going to have to start to go up. And this is
They already are.
Right. It's already happening. And so that is going to happen under Joe Biden, whether he likes it or not. Those interest rates are going to have to start creeping up. And, things that people talk about that they care about economically, like the debt. I remember a Republican in one of these groups telling me.
Yeah, I had that written down.
Telling me, I was like, oh, well, she said the debt was really important to her. And I was like, well, how do you think Trump's doing on the debt? And she said, well, I really think he's chipping away at it. And I remember being like, no, he's not. He's spending a ton. And I do feel for Biden in this, because I do think so much of this is completely beyond his control. And in some ways, we could have been raising interest rates years ago during Trump when things were really good, when we had a red hot economy, but we didn't. We kept everything cheap and flooded with cash. And
worse. The time to manage an overheating economy is when things are going good. It is exactly analogous to the argument that you see from Republicans sometimes, which says, more people have died from COVID under Biden than under Trump. Isn't that interesting? Without any recognition that the reason so many people have died is because of the way Trump managed the beginning part of the COVID and allowed it to go out of control, and then botched the vaccine rollout and then polarized the acceptance of vaccines. And the same thing is true on the economy, where when things were going well and some brakes could have been applied to it to make it more sustainable, Trump kept throwing coal into the furnace, or pumping it full of sugar, whatever metaphor you want, because he wanted the economy super sweet for when he was running for reelect. And I don't know what the answer is, but there was one voter in your Texas Dem group who really impressed me. And she said, it's like we're in the same storm, but all in different boats. And I thought, yes, you, ma'am, you get it. You understand that is exactly what this is like, right? And your view of the world right now is entirely different if you are a renter looking to buy a house than if you are a retiree sitting in a house that's paid off, right? These are two totally different views of the world.
Let's take a break. And when we come back, we are going to get into who blames Biden and who doesn't with these groups. We'll be right back.
So do you ever listen to a Bulwark podcast but wish you could also weigh in with your comments or your questions? Join us for Thursday Night Bulwark. Every Thursday at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, join a rotating cast of Bulwarkers on Zoom to talk about the day's news or go deeper on topics that don't get their due in the fast-paced news cycle. Political news today is a lot of things, but it is not boring. And our team is here to help you make sense of it all. Thursday Night Bulwark is only available to Bulwark Plus subscribers, so join us at plus.thebulwark.com.
All right, JVL. So what was interesting to me listening to these voters across the political spectrum talk about inflation, gas prices, grocery prices, housing prices, they sounded exactly the same as they would talk about sort of the pain points. But the key difference, the main way that they separated from each other, is who they blamed. So let's listen to the Republicans first.
I think inflation is a major issue. Government spending is out of control, and he's just making it worse.
My top issues are probably inflation, which obviously everyone's talked about. He's been terrible on.
I think economic policies are the most important. I mean, that's kind of why I've been a Republican all these years. I like business-friendly economic policies. I'm concerned about inflation. I'm concerned about the budget deficit.
Last year, we spent 40% of our GDP. Where do you think inflation's coming from? We poured too much money from the government into this country. People are not working. People are staying home. It's ludicrous.
So I got to say, this is a super common thing that you hear from the Republican voters, which it is all of the money that was pumped into the economy, really with the rescue plan. Do you think that that's a fair, I mean, certainly Republicans are going to push on that. That is something that people have definitely sort of internalized. But do you agree with that assessment?
No, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. And that group, the Texas Republicans, saying that the Fed is going to raise interest rates too, which is going to be a disaster, both against inflation and also against fighting inflation. You listen to this and it's like somebody who's living in a parallel universe. This view that Trump is in control of things and that everything was doing great before. The people who were worried about debt and deficit, there were two of them in that group who talked about how this is part of the reason they're Republicans. It's because of debt and deficit. Who's the last Republican who was good as president on debt and deficit? Who was it? Because since Reagan, that debt and deficits have not been important. We've had literally a single president who's been good on debt and deficits since 1980, and that was Bill Clinton, as it turns out, who balanced the budget. And the disconnect from reality on the part of these Republican voters, matched with the intensity of their feelings, is what I think is so ominous for Democrats going into 2022.
I do think it's ominous because you'll admit at least the uniformity with which this has sunk in, right? Like this has penetrated.
Oh, yeah.
Again, the perception being reality. And at least Republicans talk about the debt and deficit a lot. I'll admit I'm a deficit hawk over here. Like debt, it was one of the things that got me into Republican politics. Like, hey, you can't just spend, because I feel like Republicans at least talk the talk. They do not walk the walk. So,
which is worse, though. Isn't it worse to talk the talk and not walk it than to just be upfront about your view of the world?
There is a hypocrisy to it, of course, and so it is terrible in that regard. I would say that it is nice to hear people say things like you cannot just spend money infinitum and there not be consequences. I think that is true, and I think more often you hear Democrats are being like, sure, you can. Spend. But the problem is that Republicans say the right things and then, of course, behave differently. Donald Trump especially. I mean, George W. Bush, it was more about the Iraq War, but with Trump, it was just, let's just
also
keep
Medicare Part D. I mean, Bush expanded the government relentlessly, as did Reagan before him, and when he was spending the Soviet Union. Again, this isn't a complaint. I can make up good reasons why these presidents governed as a matter of economics as they did, and why their spending made sense for the time. But also, I mean, Trump's spending was profligate, and yet, again, it's the total disconnect from reality on the part of these voters, which is what, when you asked before, what does Biden have a path back? I don't know. I mean, do you have a path back when you have voters who are totally untethered to reality? I don't know that there's a path back with that.
I have ideas on this, but I'm going to save them for the end. I want to just because I want to hear the Democrats on this in terms of who they blame, because I think it gets to the point you've been making about how different these voters sound.
Inflation, a lot of that's, caused by the pandemic. Gasoline prices, the president doesn't have any power over that.
The inflation thing is a concern, but again, I think I agree with the consensus of what I'm hearing, that it's not a lever in the desk in the Oval Office.
Prices at the store, yes, they're going up. But then you see the news reports where Starbucks is going to raise the price of their coffee by 30% after experiencing record profits for the last 2 years. ExxonMobil, they want to raise the price of gasoline after 2 straight years of windfall. I mean, it's just greed right now. Is the inflation. Would be wonderful if the government would just kind of nip that in the bud, but then you'll have the people on the far right screaming, you're inhibiting free enterprise and whatnot. The prices right now are reflecting just the culture of America, essentially, if you look around, and Americans are seen as greedy. Unfortunately, a lot of us are, but it needs to be tapped down. Like Jeff Bezos is raising the price of Amazon Prime. Why? Yeah. Does he need to build another penis-shaped rocket? I mean, come on.
Here's my question for you. Do you think that they sound more sophisticated to you and have more explanations because they are trying to explain it away and rationalize because they're Democrats on behalf of Biden? Or do you think that they actually have a more sophisticated view of the economy?
As I was listening to them, I knew you were going to ask that question. And I thought back to the episode of this show we did last season where we had two different focus groups. And the Republican focus groups talked about Biden as a socialist who was trying to defund the police and was going to bring communism to America. I don't like these just insane stuff. And the Democratic group, when you asked them about Trump, they were like, yeah, I understand how people could decide to vote for him. And, like people are kind of like fed up and they look at somebody and they think he's plain spoken and they're not evil people. They're not bad people. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Like the Democrats have this totally nuanced view of Trump voters and of the appeal of Trump himself, even if they believe he's totally dangerous and a threat to democracy. This was, again, in the same vein. These people were not apologizing for Joe Biden. They were looking at the economic environment and saying, yes, it's very complicated and it's not good. Right. And they were not saying that these things don't exist. They were saying that these things exist in an incredibly complex matrix of inputs and outputs, and that there isn't a lever on the desk that you can just pull to make them go away. And I think that's right. But yet those people with those explanations, I think, and you're the expert on this, not me, tell me if I'm wrong, they did not sound like they were willing to crawl over glass to go vote for Democrats in 8 months. And the Republicans sounded like they would absolutely do anything. It didn't even matter who the Republican on the ballot was. It didn't matter if it was a rhino squish or a full MAGA or a QAnon crazy. They hate Biden, they hate Democrats, and they want to go vote against them.
So there's two things that I tell people when they ask me about the differences between Republicans and Democrats. I can talk about it sort of political science-y in terms of an enthusiasm gap, or I can say this, which I think is true. The Republicans hate the Democrats more than the Democrats hate the Republicans. There's the guy from Michigan. I use his quote all the time because I was like, well, who do you want to vote for in 22? He was like, I can't wait to go vote in 22. And I said, oh, for who? And he said, any living, breathing Republican. Like, just get rid of these guys. And I do think that the thing that you were talking about in the beginning about there's just a pall hanging over this administration. It's the atmospherics in general of people kind of being like, wow, things feel bad, I think is really, really true. Now, that being said, the question about how does Joe Biden potentially crawl out of that? I mean, because he knows, right? I mean, inflation hasn't been this high since the 70s and 80s. It's what killed Carter. And I think that, beginning of Biden's administration, he's getting a lot of LBJ comparisons. It's been sliding into Carter territory as we go. I think there's two paths out. And I think they're both kind of happening. One is COVID goes away. And after this, Omicron just burned through the country. You are seeing, so I don't know if you saw the CDC just lifted the national emergency that was COVID, or we've been living under national emergency now for 2.5 years, almost 3. It's over. We finally got something from the kids' school that masks, they're going to start thinking about the masks coming off. And I think for a lot of people, the masks are off in schools. And so if COVID is in retreat for real, and we've been here before where we thought it was, I think nothing hurt Joe Biden worse than the dual Delta surge hitting the same time as the Afghanistan pullout, right? Like that's when you saw his poll numbers crater and he's never recovered.
Hard agree.
I don't know whether this NPR poll that has him jumping 8 points since the State of the Union is true. It's just one poll. But I would not be shocked if we started to see his numbers go back up based entirely on conditions improving around COVID. And I do think that a lot of these inflation, they have been attendant consequences of COVID, supply chain, labor shortages. And so if COVID is in fact gone and those things start to abate, I do think that is one of the major paths out. The other path out is that, look, none of us know what's going to happen with Russia invading Ukraine, but it is plausible that one of the reasons that in this first poll where Biden's got this big jump, that there is a rally around the flag effect happening to some degree, and that it causes a shift in perspective. And you get, just like Afghanistan and Delta had the dual cratering effect, that you get rallying around Zelensky and the Ukrainians, people feeling like Biden's handling that well as COVID going away, that starts to lift him back up. Plausible?
No.
Oh,
I just don't. I'm sorry. I just don't think so. The Democrats are going to lose the House. And the only real question is whether bad candidate selection on the part of Republicans in the Senate can cause enough of avoidable losses in order for the Dems to hang on to the Senate. The bump we're seeing right now is largely Democrats coming home, right? Because the reason
That's
Biden
true.
was at such a nadir was that he was losing Dems on those polls, and he's getting those people coming home now. And so we should expect that, right? I think his natural floor is probably like 44%, 46%, not like 42, 41 where he had been. So
38.
38 and some, yeah. No, you saw that, right? I think his natural floor is a good bit higher than that. And if things start to go well, he'll creep up to that natural floor. But the polarization is not going to go away. Look at the way elected Republicans are treating this crisis by running around and calling Biden weak, calling him a liar. Donald Trump put out a statement. No, not a statement. I guess it was on with Maria Bartiromo the other day, and basically encouraging China to attack Taiwan because of how weak Joe Biden was. Our polarization is so deep that I cannot imagine a rally around the flag effect happening in any meaningful way for Biden on anything. Not war, not COVID, not nothing.
Yeah. So I take your point that it is Democrats and independent Dem leaners coming home. I think you're absolutely right about that. My position has always been that it is not that people hate Joe Biden, but that it is a lot of these conditions that are dragging him down. And my frustration has been that, look, while he can't do much about those conditions, he could do a lot about how he's communicating about them, how visible he is on that. I mean, one of the absolute through lines in the focus groups, especially among Dems, is how little they see of Joe Biden. They feel like we've been lurching from crisis to crisis, and he's just not that visible. But, it wouldn't shock me that he came out and gave, I have my qualms with the laundry list in the middle of stuff of Dem priorities. I thought the State of the Union speech could have been half as long and twice as effective if he'd focused on Ukraine, COVID, funding the police, and then the economy. But it was in there. I mean, he really did try to make it a top priority in that speech.
Record job growth, higher wages. Too many families are struggling to keep up with their bills. Inflation is robbing them of gains they thought otherwise they would be able to feel. I get it. That's why my top priority is getting prices under control. Look, our economy roared back faster than almost anyone predicted, but the pandemic meant that businesses had a hard time hiring enough people because of the pandemic to keep up production in their factories.
I mean, he's explaining it to people. He's acknowledging the pain. Like, I thought that was good.
Yeah, it's good. I think it is good. I just don't. Again, I don't know how he really gets, absent a clear contrast, so absent the presence of Donald Trump as the competitor, right, until you have a binary choice. I find it hard to see him getting over 50% approval because we're just so deeply polarized.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on getting really much over 50%. I do think that, look, I think good news begets good news. And I think that if he sees a spate of polls here post the State of the Union that have him back up at 45, 47%, that is, I agree with you, House is gone, but like, I think it staves off a kind of bloodbath.
Good news is not good news, though, because as you yourself said, Sarah, the reality is the communications, right? Or whatever your excellent formulation is on this, right? Whatever people think is reality is what reality is. And,
but that's my point. What if people perceive that things are getting better? Their lives are improving. This is why I like the focus groups about, and why we argue about that. You can say that at a macro level, the economy's good, but like if they are driving less because of gas, people can say, well, everything's open. Why are people saying things aren't open? And I'm telling you, as long as their kids' schools are still disrupted, they got to wear masks, things like that. Like people do feel direct consequences to their lives that make them feel like things are bad. If the masks come off, if the inflation, starts to ameliorate a little bit and COVID's in the rear view, economy's picking up, like.
If Laura Ingraham tells them that things are bad, then things are bad. I want to jump back real quick to the McKinnon episode because there was something that really struck me in listening to you.
Oh, did you listen to the McKinnon episode?
Of course I did, Sarah. I listen to everything you do. When there was this really interesting dichotomy between the way the this was a conversation with Trump voters, when they talked about Trump and what they liked about Trump. It was that he's unorthodox, he's unpredictable, he challenges the status quo, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind. That's why he was so great, right? Then he started talking about Greg Abbott, and they all loved Greg Abbott. Why did they love Greg Abbott? Because he's steady. One of them said, because he's boring and he does his job. Do you see what I'm saying? These are people for whom consistency does not exist. Consistency of mind is just a rumor. I
don't know if you've met humans. I don't know if you've met humans, but it is not this. There are not always linear through lines, as I have found.
I have met humans, and it's why I try to stay away from them because they are ridiculous. And it's just, again, looking at this stuff, it becomes very, very hard to understand how any of this waves hands broadly works. You did a focus group that I don't think we've touched on yet with young GOP voters. And one of them says the economy and inflation are so important to him. And he says that if things ever get really bad, he can move to a red state. And then he says, an actual red state, not Ohio. Because he's living in Ohio and he does not consider Ohio to be a real red state. And I just thought, what? I'm sorry? Like, what world do you live in? What does that even mean?
He's got to go down to the free land of Florida. That's where the free people are.
Ohio is way more red than Florida is. And it just strikes me that we have the voters of our two parties living in very separate realities. And the Democrats live pretty close to actual real life as it exists in the world, and many of the Republican voters, especially the ones I see in your focus groups, do not. They seem to experience a world which does not exist except within a right-wing echo chamber.
JVL, as always, you're my favorite person to fight with over the economy. And voters, thank you so much for being on the show. Next week, we are going to be back with an episode, fresh focus groups, all about Ukraine. And so I hope you will come back and join us again soon. Appreciate you, JVL.
Bye, best friend.
Hey, it's Rich Eisen, and my first guest of season 3 of Just Getting Started happens to be the new host of this podcast, my better half, Susie Schuster. You've got one of the most unique stories of how you got started, so why don't you come across the hall, take the chair, and oh boy, wait a minute, I think I locked the door. That's not a metaphor for anything.
How's the lighting in here? I mean, I'm vain, So I thought for the first season, try to bring you people I thought were diverse and different and maybe interesting, and that's why I started off with Jeffrey Ross, the comedian. And then, we've got a bunch of other asks out, making Paul Rudd do it. Sorry, Paul, do you know that you're doing it? And I want this to be inspirational. Life is really hard right now, and sometimes you just need a little bit of help, someone to reach out their hand and pull you along, or to push you from behind and say, you can do this. And I'm hoping that's what you're going to get from Just Getting Started.
Go follow Just Getting Started wherever you get your favorite shows.
Get an inside look at Hollywood with Michael Rosenbaum.
Let's get inside of Kristen Krug. You would do anything if you love the role.
If it was healthy, I would never want to hurt myself for a role.
Because there's some roles, there's like that guy on Walking Dead, they say he didn't shower a lot, he smelled on set. He wanted to be that kind of character. Could you see yourself doing that?
What's the point? Isn't that what makeup's for?
Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.